We are getting into some pretty heavy ideas regarding the day of Yehovah with this class. So these are going to be kind of some new concepts because Christianity, Judaism, most religious sects today have the idea that there is this end judgment day that is normally called the day of Yehovah that is forthcoming at some point in time in the future. I'm going to kind of challenge some of those sacred cows tonight, but I'm not doing this on my own. I'm doing this based on what the testimony itself says. Now, remember, the testimony that we are looking at tonight is going to be Leviticus 26. And Leviticus 26 is specifically the testimony or the consequences, the blessings and the curses of the Sinai Covenant. So this one predates the later one at Moab by 40 years. And what we will find, not in tonight's class, but in future classes, is that when God contracts, when he recovenants with Israel 40 years later, he actually incorporates every single aspect of Leviticus 26. There isn't anything that is overlooked. There isn't anything that is forgotten. And what we're going to see is that they coincide with fidelity. Remember, fidelity is attention to the details. It takes really everything into account. And that is what we're going to see Deuteronomy does, as well as Leviticus. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, I'm going to go ahead and share the slideshow. So let me make sure that I have everything good to go here. All right. So anyways, and tonight I did, I have been trying for so many weeks to bring in the symbolism of wine, and I was able to do some of that with this class. We will be coming back to it again in future classes, but I want to introduce you guys to some of these ideas because, as we will see, they are very, very important for scripture, for understanding really kind of the strange and wonderful thing that Yehovah has done. In Isaiah, God states that he is known, or he has revealed himself through his judgments. So it is through those judgments that we have an understanding of who our God is. So we're going to go ahead and begin. And I wanted to really begin with where we left off last week and kind of recap. So let's just go over some of these verses. And I did want to show this in sort of a parallel form. So this is what the testimony states. It says, "Then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember, and I will remember the land." Now, remember that, and for some reason I have a tickle in my throat. Let me get some water here. Remember that Jeremiah also promised that after 70 years, God would remember Judah in Babylon, and he would cause Judah to return to the land of Israel, specifically to Jerusalem, and reestablish the kingdom. We also saw that throughout Leviticus 26, God uses the term 7 times for 7 times of punishment. And the phrase that is usually used is that if you will not be corrected by all the judgments I have sent thus far, then I will correct you 7 times more for your sins. And what we have seen is that these 7 times are 70-year increments that occur one right after the other. And those curses that are associated with that specific 7 times are administered during that 70-year period. Jeremiah continues this 7-time period with the time that Jerusalem, Judah would enjoy its Sabbaths, the time that the land would rest from Israel's sins. So you will notice that I've started up here with Leviticus 26, 40 through 42, but we're actually going to go back a little bit. So let's just go ahead and recap Judah's final days. We're going to begin in verses 30 through 32, because these are really important for understanding Israel's future. Hold on just a moment. My daughter has a question for me. Okay, are the boys in there?
Yeah, you can go because he says it's not his bedtime yet. Go tell
It
him.
is.
Okay.
They ate dinner?
Yes.
Okay. Real quick, come here. I'll kiss you. I love you.
I'll come up and check you.
All right. Well, I was running around today, didn't have time to see my kids earlier, so just gave them a kiss and a hug good night. So let's go ahead and recap Leviticus 26, 30 through 32. It says, "And I will destroy your high places and cut down your images and cast your carcasses upon the carcasses of your idols, and my soul will abhor you. And I will make your cities waste and bring your sanctuaries into desolation. I will not smell the savor of your sweet odors, and I will bring the land into desolation, and your enemies which shall dwell therein shall be astonished at it." Now, this is speaking of the destruction of Israel and Judah. Specifically, this is going to be the destruction of Judah at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And this is when Israel was deported off the land. But what becomes important here is that God tells Israel what's going to happen to them while they are away from the land. And this is what God says. He says that I will scatter you among the heathen, and I will draw a sword out after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. Then shall the land enjoy her Sabbaths, as long as it is desolate, and you be in your enemy's land. Even then the land shall rest and enjoy her Sabbaths, as long as it is desolate, because you did not rest in your Sabbaths when you dwelt upon it. Now notice this tells Israel that while they are scattered among the heathen, Yehovah is going to draw a sword out after them, and they will be desolate. This is very important because, as we're going to see, the next verses in Leviticus draw on this. They build on this idea of judgment during the diaspora. And this is the day of Yehovah foretold in verse 36. "And upon those that are left alive of you, I will send a faintness into their hearts in the land of their enemies, and the sound of a shaken leaf shall chase them, and they shall flee as fleeing from a sword, and they shall fall when none pursues. And they shall fall one upon another as if it were before a sword when none pursues, and you will have no power to stand before your enemies." You know, this is a horrible judgment day, as we saw last week. The Noahic Covenant, which talked about death by wild beast, death by other men, and death by one another. So the idea of each man raising his hand against his neighbor. These are the judgments that occurred during the day of Yehovah. The text continues. It says, "And you will perish among the heathen, and the land of your enemies will eat you up. And they that are left of you will pine away in the iniquities in your enemies' lands, and also in the iniquity of their forefathers shall they pine away with them." What this indicates is that when Israel is in diaspora, she does not return to the law. Let me repeat that again. When Israel is in diaspora, she does not sanctify Yehovah. She does not return to his law, but rather, as Deuteronomy 28 states, she begins to worship idols of wood and stone, which her fathers have not known. And this new iniquity, these new gods that Israel begins to worship while in diaspora, keep them within their own iniquity. It keeps them stagnant, and it makes them an easy prey to all of their enemies. Remember, when you look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 4 through 8, Yehovah states that the entire reason for his statutes, his commands, his judgments, is to make Israel the wisest and strongest of all nations. Really, you know, in this whole panorama of the survival of the fittest, Yehovah has given Israel a handbook as to how to become the fittest of all nations of the earth. But when she does not live by those strong judgments, those strong instructions, when she does not do that, instead of becoming strong, she becomes weak, and she becomes a prey into all nations where Yehovah has scattered her. So this is the judgment during the diaspora. But as we will recall last week, remember that portions of Israel were indeed humbled after 70 years. So Jeremiah had prophesied of 70 years were determined on Jerusalem for a time of diaspora. This occurred from 586 to 516. The second temple was dedicated during Sukkot of 516, the same way that Solomon's temple had been dedicated during the first temple period, also during Sukkot. Remember last week we also saw that the prayer of Daniel and Ezra parallels Deuteronomy 26 in the fact that their prayers incorporate all those aspects of Leviticus 26, right around 43-42, indicating that both Ezra and Daniel understood the time period in which they were living. In other words, they looked to the law, they looked to the testimony, and they understood that God was restoring them to the land, that he was remembering his covenants at this time period. We are going to see that Ezra's prayer contains a lot of information that we normally gloss over. We normally just kind of read it without a lot of understanding. And I hope that we can dig a little bit deeper into that tonight as well. So this is the restoration to the land during the Second Temple period. And this is Leviticus 26, 40-42. And we looked at this briefly, but we're going to look at it in depth this time. It says, if they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their forefathers with their trespass which they trespassed against me, and that they have walked contrary to me, and that I have also walked contrary to them, and I have brought them into the land of their enemies, which of course occurs right, Daniel was in the land of his enemies, Ezra was in the land of his enemies, Israel was scattered at this point in time. It says, if their uncircumcised hearts be humbled, and they accept the punishment of their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and I will remember my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. The idea of land and covenant go hand in hand. You really cannot have the covenant without the land on which to practice it. And this is because the covenant is intrinsically a national constitution. And you cannot practice or live by a national constitution unless you have secure borders in which to implement it. It would be the same way as if a group of us from the United States were to go into Africa or into Europe, and we were to set up a zone in which we said, okay, this is going to be the law of the land. This is how we are going to form our parliament. This is going to how we're going to form our government. And, foreign nations really don't take kindly to those ideas. Now, I will say, with the caveat that it is surprising how, to what degree Europe and even America, to a lesser extent, have allowed those within Islam to do that very thing. They have allowed them to set up cities, communities where Sharia is implemented and where the laws of the land are ignored. And not only are they ignored, but they are deemed invalid in those zones. So that is something that is an anomaly. But should you or I try to do that in a foreign land, it would not fly. And I guarantee you that we would be behind bars quite quickly. So for God to restore Israel to the land meant that he was giving them the opportunity to live by his covenant once more, to sanctify him and his way of life. Anytime God remembers the covenant, it is always a redeeming to the land, and it is another attempt at establishing Israel in all of his ways so that they can once again become the fittest nation on earth. Now, this gets into some of the controversy I was mentioning before. The rebellion and diaspora of the Second Temple era. The Second Temple era is usually thought of in several ways. Most people think that Israel should have had a time of salvation, that there should have been a time where God's kingdom on earth was established, and for whatever reason it did not occur. As we will see, both the testimony of Leviticus 26 as well as the testimony of Deuteronomy 28 acknowledge the fact that God knew that time of salvation, that time of utopia, the time of restoration, of a final restoration, was not to be for the Second Temple period. And this is why. When you follow the chronology of Leviticus 26, you know, verses 40 through 42 had this restoration to the land, the remembering of the covenant. But look at what happens in verse 43. This is what God says. And the land also shall be left of them, and the land shall enjoy her Sabbaths, while she is desolate without them. And they shall accept the punishment of their iniquity, because they despise my judgments, and because their soul abhorred my statutes. You know, this is the very same thing that God states regarding Israel right around verse 36. During the first temple period, it says that the land will be left of them and that the land will enjoy her Sabbaths. Now, we don't normally think of this verse applying or anything applying to the Second Temple period, because it's just kind of this nebulous intermediate period that just hangs out there in limbo. But this text tells us that the people in the Second Temple period will despise Yehovah's judgments, and they will abhor his statutes. That is not something that is usually attributed to the Jodell Knesset, the idea of this great assembly that met during the Second Temple period and created a hedge around the Torah. That's usually looked at with great respect, with great veneration. So the question then becomes, how do we reconcile what the testimony says with what Judaism or Christianity believes today? How is that to be reconciled? Well, let's look at some of the future verses. Let's look at Daniel's 70 weeks. And this really becomes pivotal as far as timing and as far as, I would say, a limit to Yehovah's mercy during the Second Temple period. So this is going to be Daniel 9:24. And Daniel says, 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon the holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make a reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Now, I understand that there are many, many approaches to Daniel's 70 weeks. Just a few caveats to put out there for consideration. Remember, Daniel was a wise man in Babylon. And a lot of what Daniel writes is a little bit different from the rest of the Torah, because he often borrows from Babylonian mythologies, not mythologies, but methodologies. He often borrows from what he learned from the school that he attended in Babylon. In Babylon, a week was not 7 days as it was in Israel, but a week actually lasted 10 days in Babylon. So that's a little bit different. But what it appears is that Daniel uses 70 weeks as a continuation of Leviticus 26's 7 times. So it appears that once again, Daniel is allotting 70 years for Israel to sanctify Yehovah, for Israel to make an end of transgression, for Israel to turn from her sins, and to finally sanctify Yehovah. So what this does is this really gives us, let me give you the time period here. This really gives us from 516 BCE all the way down to around 458 BCE. I'm sorry, 447 BCE. So from 516 to about 446, 447 BCE is the time period in which Israel was allotted. This was kind of the limit of Yehovah's mercy for this generation. Remember, their forefathers had been continually rebellious. God had forgiven them in the wilderness. He had forgiven them during the Judges period. He had forgiven them during the First Temple period. So now, during the Second Temple period, Daniel states that God is giving a limit to his mercy, which will only last for 70 years. Now, who lived during the first 70 years on the land? This becomes very important. Not only did Daniel live on the land of Israel, because he is actually recorded as being in Jerusalem and making a covenant between God and Israel. He's one of the elders. But you also find that Mordecai is there. You find that Ezra and Nehemiah also lived during the first 70 years. Israel is restored to the promised land. So this becomes very important. Now, God also gives the second temple remnant a chance to sanctify his way, a opportunity to be strong once again, to be blessed, and to walk in his ways. And this is what Haggai states regarding Yehovah's blessing. And this was at the dedication or the laying of the foundation of the second temple. It says, consider now from this day and upward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, even from that day that the foundation of Yehovah's temple was laid, consider it. Is the seed yet in the barn? Yes. And yet the vine and the fig tree and the pomegranate and the olive tree has not brought forth. From this day forward, basically, I will bless you. So God removes all the curses of the law, all the curses that had been on Israel, with the caveat that they were still under Persian oppression. But there was a time of intermission, a time of blessing where Israel was given opportunity to sanctify Yehovah and to become righteous. So the question is, what does Israel do with this opportunity during her first 70 years on the land? And I just want to remind you, before we go forward too far, I have also come in talking with people, whether it be rabbis, ministers, that one of the ideas that circulates out there is that the commandments given in the Torah to Israel by Moses regarding their entry into the land right before the initial conquest of Canaan in 1508 BCE, that those commands were only for ancient Israel at that time, and that they were tossed off. They were no longer binding during the Second Temple era. There is a problem with that theory in that Israel had never fully fulfilled those original commandments. In other words, Israel had never obeyed the instructions given to them by the hand of Moses. She constantly ignored them. She constantly made covenants and treaties with the people of Canaan. So all of these covenants were binding, and beyond that, the philosophy, the policy established in those instructions had one purpose. And that purpose was to make Israel the fittest and strongest of all nations, to make her be able to prevail above her enemies so that her enemies could never prevail against her. So this is one of the commands that was still binding during the Second Temple era. This was God's command to Israel in Exodus 23, verses 31 through 33. It says, I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. Now, have things changed in 1,000 years? Were the gods during the Second Temple era any less a threat or a snare to Israel than at the Judges period? As we will see in our forthcoming classes, there were many deities that were worshipped on Israel's land, and those deities were often combined in the worship with Yehovah, so they were meshed together. Kind of an all-inclusive ecumenical approach to religion even at that time. But we're also going to see, or we're going to seek to answer the question, did Israel make covenants with the natives of the land during this time period when they were first restored during the first 70 years. Now, another command that was binding on Israel was Numbers effacement judgment, which is recorded in Numbers 33. And let's just go through this real quick, because this is how God establishes his covenant with Israel. This is how he makes them strong, so that there are no terrorist attacks, so that there are no enemies within and there are no enemies without, so that Israel can build houses where she wants, so that her sanctuaries and the land on which her sanctuary sits is never given to her enemies. It is only by not observing this policy that the land is divided and lost to Israel's control, whether it be anciently or modernly. These are eternal precepts, eternal principles and philosophy that do not change, because the survival of the fittest works the same today as it did 1,000, 2,000, or 3,500 years ago. So this is, again, Yehovah's command regarding his effacement judgment. Drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all their pictures and destroy their molten images, and quite pluck down their high places. Dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell therein, for I have given you the land to possess it. Divide the land by lot for an inheritance among your families, and to the more you shall give the more inheritance, and to the fewer you shall give the less inheritance. Every man's inheritance shall be in the place where his lot falls. According to your tribes of your fathers, you will inherit it. Now, what I did not put here, and if you guys will look up verse 55, do this on your own, Numbers 33, verse 55, Yehovah states, if you do not fulfill all the words of this command, then as I sought to do to them, I will do to you. So if the Second Temple remnant do not achieve a time of prosperity, if they do not achieve a time of national independence and a time of righteousness, it is because they have not followed this command. And what we will see in our upcoming classes is that during the Second Temple period, both Egypt and Rome indeed divided the land for a lot and an inheritance for the heathen again. So all of these commands, everything that occurs really repeats itself during the Second Temple period. So the question is why? Why do these judgments fall on Israel again? Was Israel righteous? Did she obey these commands during the Second Temple period? Now, the Second Temple remnant still needed to obey all of Yehovah's commandments so that he could fulfill his covenants with Israel, as I had stated before. But the question really comes down to this, and that question is, was the Second Temple period remnant righteous? And the reason this is so important is because if they were righteous and Yehovah did not bless them with salvation, if he did not establish them on the land and protect Israel from all of the enemies as had been promised in his covenants, then that would mean that Yehovah had sinned. Let me repeat that. If Yehovah did not fulfill his part of the bargain, if the Second Temple remnant, the Jews living in Judea during the Second Temple period, if they became righteous, if they sanctified the Torah, and God did not fulfill the promises within his covenant to make Israel live in peace and safety, to never be uprooted again, if that scenario occurred and Yehovah did not fulfill his word, then Yehovah sinned, and there is no righteousness with him. So if Yehovah is a righteous deity, if he indeed is a deity that exists and he lives by what is written, then there must be another explanation. And it really comes down to the question as to whether or not the people living in Judea, the seed of Abraham, were righteous during this time period, during this first 70 years or 70 weeks that Israel lived on the land. So this is another important point as we get into Ezra and Nehemiah. Remember, Ezra lived during the first 70 years on the land. As a matter of fact, he returned to Judea right around perhaps 460 BCE. He may have returned earlier, but it was at least by 460. And Nehemiah, who was the acting Tarshatha, or governor of the land of Judea when Israel or Judah was first reestablished on the land, he made a proclamation, kind of an ordinance for the Levites at this time. So this would have been very early in Judah's history, or Judea's history. This would have been probably right around right around 523 BCE, when Judah had come back to the land of Israel at the order of King Cyrus. And they lived there for about 10-15 years before they established the foundations of the temple, which would later be built upon and dedicated in 516. So we're looking at about a 20-year period. But this was Nehemiah's instructions. He said, and the Tarshatha said to them, they should not eat of the most holy things till there stood up a priest with Urim and with Thummim. Now, what you find is that when Ezra returns to Judea, he sets the priests in their courses, and the priesthood begins to function. The priesthood begins to eat of the holy things with Ezra's arrival in Judea. So Ezra becomes a very key player in this Second Temple period. We can trust what he has written, and we can even trust his editing of scriptures, because he indeed was a priest with Urim and Thummim. He was a descendant of the house of Aaron through Zadok, and he had access, the right to serve as an acting, officiating priest. So what becomes very important at this point is Ezra's testimony and Nehemiah's testimony regarding the Second Temple period remnant. So this is going to be Nehemiah's testimony first. And we're just going to go ahead and read through this. It says, in those days I saw in Judah some treading the winepress on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. Now, remember, the Sabbath was so important. And if you followed my classes, you know that throughout my classes, I've talked about covenants. One of the peculiar aspects of Israel's covenants with Yehovah is that they always had a sign of compliance. The aspect of the Sinai Covenant that showed Israel was in compliance, that she was observing the covenant at Mount Sinai, was that of the Sabbath, and that is mentioned in Exodus 31 verses 16 through right around 21. Verse 21 is Yehovah states that the Sabbaths are a sign between him and his people. So what Nehemiah is telling us is that very soon of Judah being back on the land, these people were violating the Sabbath. They were conducting business on the Sabbath day. They were bringing their wares into the city of Jerusalem to sell them. So this is a very egregious transgression right after Israel is restored to the land. Let's continue. It says, and there dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish and all manners of ware, and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is it that you do to profane the Sabbath day? So notice the nobles of Judah, the elders of Judah were accomplices in this transgressing of the Sabbath. And Nehemiah points out, did not your fathers do this? And did not our God bring all this evil upon this city? Yet you bring more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. This is a very important point. Nehemiah recognizes that Judah's violation of the Sabbath will cause them to bring more wrath on Israel. This sin was not something that Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Zephaniah, none of these prophets were ignorant to the fact that these sins had consequences even during the Second Temple period. Let's go now to Deuteronomy. This is going to be a command in Deuteronomy that instructs Israel not to marry the inhabitants of the land. And the reason you don't want to do this is twofold. Number one, you form relationships with the natives of the land. You form alliances with them. You don't want to drive them out of the land because you begin to love them and you develop relationships with them. Even though their philosophies, their way of life is detrimental to you and your future, you overlook it for the sake of relationships. So in Deuteronomy, God tells them to drive out the inhabitants of the land. And specifically, God mentions the Amorites, the Canaanites. He mentions 7 nations, and we're going to skip down to the second paragraph. It says, when Yahweh your God shall deliver them before you, you shall smite them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. Neither shall you make marriage with them. Give your daughter you shall not give to his son, nor his daughter shall you take to your son. For they will turn away your son from following me and serve other gods. So will the anger of Yehovah be killed against you to destroy you suddenly. What we're going to see, and this really incorporates the verse that we looked earlier in Exodus, how you should not make covenants with the natives of the land and how you should not make marriages with them. Now, Ezra saw this command still binding during the Second Temple era. And this is what Ezra writes. He says, in those days, I also saw Jews that had married the wives of Ashdod, of Ammon and Moab. Now, Ashdod would have been the children of the Philistines, as well as the children of the Canaanites. So, and their children spoke half in the speech of Ashdod and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them and cursed them and smote certain of them and plucked off their hair and made them to swear by Elohim, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons for wives. So at this point, Ezra is totally acknowledging the validity of the instruction in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Now, let me just, before we go on real quick, address the fact that the children spoke half of the speech of Ashdod. A lot of people see this verse as one that states that only Hebrew is an accepted language and only Ivrit should be the language that will be restored one day. That is really a separate issue. What Ezra is specifically addressing here is the fact that Israel was losing their national identity, their national sovereignty, because they were assimilating into the nations that were around them, and they were losing their national independence. Same thing for those of us in America today. As long as English remains the official language, we have a lot of autonomy, we have a lot of independence. But if all of our official documents, all of our official communication begins to occur in either Spanish or in Arabic, that is a sign that we have lost our national sovereignty, our national ability to govern ourselves. So it's symptomatic of a bigger problem that does not seek self-preservation through following the strong statutes and judgments that God has given. Or for us in America, the statutes and judgments in the U.S. Constitution. So we're going to go ahead and continue with Ezra's testimony. Says Ezra continues to contend with the elders and with the priesthood. And he says, did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him. For he was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish wisdom women cause to sin. Shall we then listen to you to do all this great evil, to transgress against our God in marrying strange wives? So Ezra sees that the Jews intermarrying with the inhabitants of the land during this time was a sin. It was a great evil in Yehovah's sight, just as had been outlined within Deuteronomy 7. So Ezra acknowledges that Deuteronomy 7 was still binding during the Second Temple period. It says, and one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horite. Therefore I chased him from me. Remember them, O God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. This last paragraph is really detrimental to any that would claim that the Second Temple period Jews, are that remnant, became a righteous people. The fact that the priesthood had intermarried with Sanballat, an open enemy of Israel, shows that there was a covenant, there was an alliance. Anytime there was marriage during this time period, especially among the ruling families, it was always indicative of an alliance between those two political factions. We've also find out later in Nehemiah as well as in Ezra that the tithes and offerings that Judea's citizens brought to the temple, those tithes and offerings were actually given to Sanballat. They were not even used to support the priesthood. So what happens during the Second Temple priesthood? What you find is that very early on, by about 400 BCE, the priesthood, for all practical purposes, ceases to exist because it is no longer supported. And instead of the priesthood and the Levites serving the people, all of a sudden you have a rival scribal class that begins issuing edicts, begins issuing policy for the Judean remnant, and almost utterly supplants the priesthood within the first 100 years of being restored on the promised land. But the reason this occurs is because their means of livelihood, their tithes, are cut off from them and they are given to Israel's enemies. Now, Nehemiah's statement, remember them, this is almost a command for future generations. You find that Samuel issues a similar command to remember. And this is important. Anytime, whether it is Ezra, Nehemiah, Samuel, David, whenever the command is to remember something, it's because there is something very, very important contained with what is written. And here the important thing that is contained is the fact that Judea had become a sinful nation. They had intermarried with strange wives. They violated the Sabbath. They bought and sold on the Sabbath. They had really assimilated as one of the nations on the land. There was nothing that sanctified them as being any different from any other pagan nation within the first 70 years of Israel being restored to the land. So Ezra really acknowledges this. And last week we looked at his statement that a little space and a little grace was given to Israel. And I wanted to return to this because this prayer of Ezra really contains a lot of information and kind of a revelation as to what Ezra understood. Remember, he had the Urim and the Thummim. So he understood what God had in store for this second temple remnant. And Sylvia and David, I'm so glad you guys could join us tonight. I'm glad you are with us. So this is what Ezra states, and we're going to begin in verse 8. It says, "And now for a little space, grace has been shown from Yehovah our God, to leave us a remnant to escape, and to give us a nail in this holy place, that our God may lighten our way, to give us a little reviving for our bondage." Notice Ezra is not saying anything at all about a latter-day salvation. He is not proclaiming that God is going to bring from the north, say, give up, and to the south, and bring your children from the east and the west, and establish them on the land, never to be uprooted again. The tone and the tenor of this prayer is the exact opposite of what all of the prophets who prophesy of salvation. There is no acknowledgement of salvation at this point in time in Ezra's prayer. Continuing, "For we are slaves, yet our God has not forsaken us in our bondage, but has extended mercy to us in the sight of the king of Persia, to give us a reviving, to set up the house of our God, and to repair the desolations thereof, and to give us a wall in Judah and in Jerusalem. And now, our God, what shall we say after this?" Now remember, when when Ezra sought to build the wall, he was confronted with Sanballat and with Tobias. Those two confederacies really worked against the reestablishment and the independence and the prospering of Judea. And unfortunately, according to Nehemiah, the priesthood was complacent with this, in the fact that they had made an alliance with the pagans of the land. They had made an alliance with Israel's enemies, and was thwarting Ezra's attempts. If you are familiar with the story in Ezra 8, he had received all of these delegations from people within Judea, urging Ezra to hide, or urging Ezra to form a confederacy, all of these different things. And much of that came from within the priesthood. So, of course, Ezra stood firm. He was very strong, and he rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem. But this is what Ezra says, after all this is said and done. He says, "For we have forsaken your commandments." Okay, the house of God has been set up. The wall in Jerusalem around Jerusalem has been erected. But what does Ezra say? He says, "We have forsaken your commandments, which you have commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, to the land which you go to possess, it is an unclean land with the filthiness of the people of the lands, with their abominations, which have defiled it from one end to the other with their uncleanliness. Now, therefore, give not your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters to your sons, nor seek their peace or wealth forever, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land and live for an inheritance for your children forever." Ezra confirms Nehemiah's testimony. Both Ezra and Nehemiah recognize that Israel had sinned, that Judah had sinned by forsaking the commandments, by making covenants and marriages with the people of the land. This weakened Israel. By making a covenant, Jehoiada, by making a covenant for his son Elisha, and making him son-in-law to Sanballat, they were seeking their wealth in direct violation of Yehovah's commands. So this again is pretty damning testimony against the Jews in Judea during the Second Temple period. Continuing in Ezra 9, and the verses are wrong. This is actually, I believe, verses 12 through 15. It says, "And after all this has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great trespass, seeing that our God has punished us less than our iniquities deserve, and has given us such a deliverance as this, should we again break your commandments and join in affinity with the people of all these abominations. Would you not be angry with us until you had consumed us, so that there should be no remnant or escaping? O God of Israel, you are righteous, for we remain yet escaped as it is this day. Behold, we are before you in our trespasses, for we cannot stand before you because of this. Ezra is acknowledging that even though Israel had recovenanted with Yehovah when they returned to the land during the dedication of the second temple, even though they had stood and they had affirmed and they had recommitted to the covenant, Ezra is acknowledging that Judea has violated that. They have violated it while newly returned and reestablished on the land of Israel. And he acknowledges that Yehovah will be angry with them and that Yehovah will consume them. And this is why Ezra could not stand before Yehovah, because they were deep in their iniquity and they're transgressing against the way of Yehovah. At this point, we're going to transition into wine and false doctrine. Very rarely does rebellion against the law of Moses, against Yehovah's command, very rarely does that happen without it being supplemented for or substituted for something else. So in other words, when someone says, oh, we should not fulfill numbers effacement judgment, we should not drive the natives out of the land, it's okay to intermarry with the natives of the land. When those ideas are put forth, there are usually other doctrines and other ideas associated with them that are part of a bigger theology, a part of a bigger issue. And what you find is that all of these false doctrines are usually described symbolically in the idea of wine. So this was something that we did not get to when we were in chapter 13, but it's really apropos to speak of it here, because the Second Temple remnant, they began imbibing a lot of false doctrines during this time period. False doctrines whereby they did not sanctify the Sabbath, or they sanctified it in a way that is alien to the prescription in the written Torah. So these are some of the prophecies that link wine with false doctrine. So we're going to begin in Psalm 75, verse 8. It says, for in the hand of Yehovah there is a cup, and the wine is red. It is full of mixture, and he pours out the same, but the dregs thereof, all the wicked of the earth, shall wring them out and drink them. So you have the idea that Yehovah has this cup in his hand. It's filled with wine. He pours it on the nations, and the nations drink them up. So when we talk about wine, it's very important to understand the process. When you drink wine, a lot of wine, your first stage is that you enjoy it. You become happy with it. You may become angry with it. Wine really affects everyone a little differently. You've heard of the happy drunk. You've heard of the sad drunk. You've heard of the angry drunk. And sometimes you have the friendly drunk. It just affects everyone differently. But after you become inebriated, a lot of times you stumble and fall. You can't see clearly. You have double vision, so you see two of everything and nothing is really real. After reaching a drunken stupor, usually the course is that you will eventually sleep it off and you will wake up again sober. So it is this process that we will see David and the prophets really build off of this idea, as does Asaph. So Isaiah also builds on this, but this is really something that is in particular to the Second Temple remnant. When we look at prophecies of the Second Temple remnant, they are not really that pleasant. So this is what Isaiah says in Isaiah 2, verse 6. He says, therefore you have forsaken your people, the house of Jacob, because they be replenished from the east and are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they please themselves in the children of strangers. You know, Isaiah wrote this a good 200 years before the second temple remnant were reestablished on the land. But Isaiah already had prophesied that Israel would intermarry with the inhabitants of the land and please themselves in the children of strangers. We also find that they become like soothsayers. Rather than sticking with a very plain and literal interpretation of Torah and actually living by it, they're going to turn into a lot of mythology, a lot of mythicism and mysticism in their approach to knowing God and the obedience to Torah. But notice the key statement. It says, because you are replenished from the east. At no other point in time was the house of Jacob replenished from the east. When Israel came out of Egypt, they actually came from the west into the land of Egypt. When they came from Babylon and from Persia, they came from the east and they repopulated the land. So continuing with this, with the idea of wine, Isaiah 63 verse 6 talks about God once again pouring wine upon the earth and making them drunk. Isaiah says, and I will tread down the people in my anger, and I will make them drunk in my fury, and I will bring down their strength to the earth. Now, I would like to encourage you, challenge you. When you look through the sacrifices that are listed in the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, you will find that 99% of the time, each and every sacrifice or sin offering that is offered before Yehovah always has a wine offering associated with it. So notice there is a correlation between wine and sacrifice. Just keep that mulling in the back of your head for a moment as we continue through the next verse. And this is Isaiah 29 verses 1, and then we're going to skip down to 7 through 10. Woe to Ariel, the city where David dwelled, and the multitude of nations that fight against Ariel, even all that fight against her in her fortification, and all that distress her shall be as a dream of a night vision. And it shall even be as when a hungry man dreams, and behold, he eats, but he awakes, and his soul is empty. Or as when a thirsty man dreams, and behold, he drinks, but he awakes, and behold, he is faint, and his soul has appetite. So shall the multitude of nations be that fight against Mount Zion. So this is the idea of nations fighting against Mount Zion, and their hunger for fighting against it is never quenched. Whether it be their hunger or their thirst is never quenched for fighting against Zion. And then Isaiah continues, stay yourselves and wonder, cry out aloud and cry, those that are drunk, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink. For Yehovah has poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep. He has closed your eyes, and the eyes of your prophets and your seers he has covered. So notice this wine that God pours out is not a literal wine, but rather it is a spiritual drunkenness. It is a spirit of deep sleep. He's closed our eyes to truth. He's closed our eyes to understanding. And if you read Isaiah 6 really goes into greater detail as to what this wine that is in Yehovah's hands, as to what it is and how he pours it out. We are going to be looking at this in greater detail when we look at the testimony of Deuteronomy 28, because there is actually a specific time period in which this occurs in Israel's history. And then going to Psalm 73, verses 8 through 10. And this is Asaph's prophecy against the second temple remnant. It says, they are corrupt and they speak wickedly concerning oppression. They speak loftily. They set their mouth against the heavens, and their tongue walks through the earth. Therefore, his people return here, and to here is specifically referring to Jerusalem, and waters of a full cup are wrung out to them. Remember earlier we saw that wine was wrung out to the nations, and here you find the waters of a full cup are wrung out to them because they are corrupt. And you find that many prophets build on this symbolism throughout the scriptures. So what we have now is that during the first 70 years, Israel does not fulfill the prophecy in Daniel 9:23. Israel does not become righteous. Israel does not sanctify the Sabbath. They oppress their brethren. Once again, they take their brethren as slaves, the same thing that they did in the previous era under Zedekiah. And so what you're going to find is that very soon Yehovah stops sending word through prophets. Zechariah and Haggai are Israel's two last prophets on the land. We're going to enter into the Song of Moses, the hiding of the face in this day of Yehovah. Now, Zephaniah really lived towards the end of the kingdom years. And what he states is very, very important regarding the day of Yehovah. He says, I will stretch out my hand upon Judah and upon all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, and the name of the Chimerians with the priest, and them that worship the host of heaven upon the housetops, and them that swear by Yehovah and swear by Malchim. Now remember, what was it Israel did? Israel always combined the worship of Yehovah with other deities, and that is what Zephaniah is referring to here. It says, and them that are turned back from Yehovah, and those that have not sought Yehovah, nor inquired for him. Behold, your peace at the presence of Yehovah, for the day of Yehovah is at hand. For Yehovah has prepared his sacrifice. So notice this idea of a sacrifice that is prepared. He has bid his guests, and it shall come to pass in the day of Yehovah's sacrifice that I will punish the princes and the king's children and all those that are clothed with strange apparel. And in that same day, I will punish all those that leap upon the threshold, which fill their master's houses with violence and deceit. So notice this strong association between the day of Yehovah and a prepared sacrifice. And remember in the law, and we're going to look at this in greater detail in the upcoming classes, but notice the association between sacrifices and wine and the day of Yehovah. So you find that nations become drunk. They become, and hold on, let me get out of this real quick. Let me get to my other screen here. Nations become drunk with departing from the way of Yehovah by justifying their own ways in his sight. By departing, they begin imbibing false doctrines, ideologies that combine to one degree or another the worship of other deities, the philosophy of paganism, of mysticism. And then after imbibing those ideas, they come out in something totally different, new ideas, new doctrines. But the result is still the same, because the end result is that Israel does not walk in the way of Yehovah. Israel does not sanctify the covenant. She does not sanctify the Sabbath in the way in which it is written in Torah. So what are some of the some of the ideas that the Second Temple remnant began to come up with? Well, one of them that we find is the prohibition of mentioning the name of Yehovah. That is a new doctrine that contradicts Deuteronomy 6:13, which states that you should use the name of Yehovah, and in his name shall you swear when taking contracts. You also find that they added regulations to the Shabbat. Originally in Exodus, The Shabbat was to be for your manservant and your maidservant. It was to be a day of rest for them. But you find that with some of the regulations that are added during the Second Temple period, all of a sudden it is only for the Jews that the Sabbath is for. Even to this day, when you are in discussions with rabbis, when you're discussions regarding Noahide, some people will get very violent with the fact that Gentiles or non-Jews should even think about observing the Shabbat. So there is a very exclusive and exclusionary ideology that has been introduced. When originally in Exodus, when you look at both Exodus chapters 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5, you find that this Shabbat was specifically for your manservant, your maidservant, your bondservant. It was for non-Israelites to have a day of rest, a day where you did not work. And unfortunately today, the tradition is that it is on those days that you can employ their labor so that you don't have to do it yourself, and really in the most mundane aspects of life. So this is a total reversal, a turning upside down of the commandments that were originally given at Sinai. This is a wine that has been poured out. And what we will find, because what we're doing right now is just scratching the surface. This class, I really wanted to introduce you to the concept of the day of Yehovah and to show you that Ezra, Nehemiah, Zephaniah, and we're going to see even Zechariah and Haggai as we go through the upcoming chapters, all of them acknowledge that the day of Yehovah was not far off from their generation. As a matter of fact, Ezekiel actually gives us a very definite time period for the time of mercy that would be allotted for Israel and allow their sins to build up until the violence of those sins were finally retributed upon Judah and upon the land, and Israel would be cast out over. I keep saying, I use Judah and Israel interchangeably. Judah was the only entity represented on the land during the Second Temple period, but you find that they are once again violently thrust out of the land. And then you find that with Roman occupation, whether it is in Judea proper or whether it is in Rome or throughout the Roman Empire, all of a sudden there are these massive persecutions of both Jews and Christians. There really is no separating Jews and Christians with the persecution that goes on in this early 1st and 2nd century AD era. They are really kind of one and the same. And the reason for that is go back to Leviticus 26, verses 36 through 39. What did God say? He said that in the land of your enemies, the sword will pursue you. Though no one chases you, it's still going to find you. And that's what you find in Rome. It didn't matter if you were Israel as a Christian. It didn't matter if you were Israel as a Jew. During that time period, the sword found you, even if you were living peaceably within the Roman Empire. So we're going to get into these concepts in greater detail, and we're going to look at them and break them down in our upcoming classes. But again, this is just an introduction into the idea of the day of Yehovah. Next week, we're going to look at what Leviticus states regarding the ideas of a day of salvation. So kind of a total reversal. What you have is at the end of this horrific day of Yehovah, where this horrific sacrifice takes place for a very long period of time. The end of that is that those that God brings through this fire, those that he brings through this horrific Holocaust, will come out shining like gold, like the gold of Ophir. And Yehovah will make a man that is very precious and finally make a generation that is willing to walk in the way of Yehovah, a generation that is willing to forsake wine, and that is finally ready to say, okay, let's do it your way, God. Let's try the precepts and protocols that will make us a strong and mighty nation where no one can stand before us. So that is what we're going to look at next week. And then in the following weeks, we are going to be getting into the parallel between Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the parallel and see its chronological fulfillment. So this is where, as we go through the chronology, it is really going to come alive. So that does conclude our class for this week. Let me just state that I did say our class next week. I said that in error. We will not have class next week. I am on a college university expedition with my children who are going to engineering schools. So we are going to be at colleges next week, and so I will not be here. So we will meet again in 2 weeks. March is going to be kind of, the first couple of weeks of March are going to be kind of helter-skelter. So what I may do is opt for a Saturday class or rearrange our schedule from Friday night for one or two of those, just so we don't get behind in covering this material. So I appreciate you guys joining me. Do you have any questions or comments? Please feel free to ask. This is always an open forum, and I look forward to questions, comments, or any clarifications. And once again, all we did tonight was scratch the surface. When we get into Deuteronomy 28 has a lot of detail, and it fills in a lot of the gaps, a lot of the question marks that Leviticus 26 leaves open. Oh, thank you, David. I appreciate that. And I hope all of you guys will join me tomorrow morning at 10:30 Central Time at at United Israel. I'm still getting that down. And if you are looking for a venue to come and meet everyone that is on this list, or you know, interact, I will be at the United Israel Conference in St. Francisville the end of April. If you go to Facebook, look at the United Israel webpage, or ask to join the United Israel group. We will be meeting in St. Francisville the end of April, and I invite each and every one of you to join us. It would be great to see you and to meet many of the handles that I see on Facebook, in this room, and all of those that have emailed me throughout the last couple of years. So anyways, have a great evening. Shabbat Shalom, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.